Okay, hey everyone, I'm G from Red Hat, and today I'll be doing a lightning talk on SLSA and what's changed in version 1.0. So as far as the agenda goes, I'll do a very brief description of what SLSA is, then I'll cover the changes in a few, 4 or 5 different areas in a few slides, and I'll also mention briefly at the end what's next at Adoptium in relation to these changes. So yeah, what is SLSA? It stands for Supply Chain Levels for Software Artifacts, and there's a link to the website here, salsa.dev, where you can get a lot of information, but quoting verbatim from said website, it's a security framework, a checklist of standards and controls to prevent tampering, improve integrity, and secure packages and infrastructure. So it's essentially a lot of text around securing your supply chain of software artifacts. It gives you recommendations and tries to provide an easy to consume checklist to essentially apply to whatever project you might be working on to secure it. So in terms of changes for v1.0, as far as context goes, SLSA's been in development for a few years at this point at the upstream project at salsa.dev, and they did have a few drafts prior, with one of them being version 0.1, which did cover actually quite a lot of content in terms of what needs to be done for the different levels of security that they had in SLSA. And they most recently, I guess maybe a month ago now at this point, released their first full release, version 1.0. And in that release, there were actually a lot of significant changes between the most previous 0.1 to this one. So I'll be trying to cover a few of those at a high level. So the first thing they mentioned was they've settled on the versioning scheme for their future updates and releases. So version 1.0 is the first stable release, and they will follow semantic versioning for future releases. So major releases 2.0, 3.0, and onwards will include backwards incompatible changes. Minor versions such as 1.1, 1.2, ... contain backwards compatible changes, but they also mentioned that editorial changes will not have a version increase. So there's no third component to the versioning, such as like 1.1.1. I guess if they update text to fix spelling mistakes or grammar or reword it to be slightly easier to understand, etc., they won't necessarily do a full update, a full version release. Next, they did a pretty big overhaul of the original concept of levels into levels that are in tracks. So the general levels that they previously had, so also level 1 to 4, is now replaced completely by the concept of tracks and individual levels within them. So previously, SLSA had 4 different levels that covered increasing difficulty, I suppose, or increasing strength of the security of a project and the supply chain and its artifacts. And each of those levels had details of the requirements needed there. And they've split that out now into separate tracks that focus on a specific part of the supply chain. So now there is documentation on build levels 0 to 3, 0 being nothing, and 3 being the most stringent. And it covers the area of building your artifact. And they've mentioned that in the future, they hope to introduce a level 4 for build, as well as a track for the source via source levels. And so that source track would cover securing your sources as part of the supply chain. And then I suppose as they further develop, they might add more tracks in different areas with different names, but they haven't mentioned any specifics there at this point, at least in the v1.0 doc. Alongside that, they updated the core specification quite heavily. And so the general goal they mentioned there was to make it continue to make the core spec easier to understand and apply. So there's better terminology. The security levels were completely rewritten as described before. And there were updates for producing artifacts, distributing provenance, verifying artifacts, verifying build platforms, and covering threats and mitigations. So essentially, they redid the text that explains these different sections, what it means to produce artifacts, what it means to distribute provenance, etc., and tried to make it easier to understand and also easier to apply. Um, and so if you visit the SLSA.dev and read through the version 1.0 docs, it should be fairly easy to understand. And of course, they are always open to feedback as well through their various upstream channels. And so specifically on the verification front, they highlighted that the documentation around verifying provenance is now included in version 1.0, and it covers what it means to establish trust in build platforms, and then what it means to establish trust in the artifacts. And the provenance itself has a new format. So it's aimed at addressing the rigidity of the previous provenance format, and the verification summary attestation format has also been updated. So this covers the provenance of SLSA. So when you try to say that you've reached a specific level or you've achieved a level of security as defined by SLSA, how do you actually state that? What proof do you provide for that? And so that all of that proof is supposed to be in this provenance, and they have a specification that covers the format there. In the previous version, it was noted that the format was quite rigid and difficult for all the different projects, all the different software projects with their different dependencies, different build formats, different build setups, etc., to fit into that single specification that SLSA had. And so they've made this new format, I guess, more pluggable in a way so that different projects can address the provenance requirements in their own manner. So yeah, that was one of the other big updates in v1.0. So that actually covers all of the highlights that version 1.0 introduced in comparison to version 0.1. And obviously, for further lower level details, I encourage you to visit the website and read through their documentation. It's pretty extensive. So what's next at Adoptium? So with these changes, it's pretty straightforward here. We will essentially work to follow the SLSA attestation process to meet at least SLSA build level 3. And assuming they introduce SLSA 4 at some point, we will just generally continue to follow updates to said SLSA specification and attempt to meet all the requirements listed there. Fortunately, in terms of what actually changed between SLSA level 1 to 4, the general ones in version 0.1 to the new SLSA build track with level 0 to 3, we are actually quite close to reaching build level 3 already. I don't think there is as much to do now as there was before, actually, for our project. So at a very high level, for the build levels, L1 is described as we have provenance that exists, such as an SBOM file. We may need to adjust it to fit whatever the SLSA requirements are, or have additional provenance alongside that, but it's not particularly too difficult. L2 mentions having a hosted build platform, which we definitely already do. And then L3 has a number of requirements around hardening the builds themselves and the build process that we'll need to investigate and mostly verify and then attest that we meet said requirements. So yeah, built L3 to cover a little more in depth. It mentions strong controls to prevent build runs from influencing one another, even within the same project, as well as preventing the secret material that we use to sign the provenance from being accessible to user-defined build steps, which may be an interesting one with all the manual Jenkins jobs that we have at the project that users start, but we'll figure that out, I'm sure. Um, so yeah, as far as SLSA attestation, we'll again work to follow their attestation specification and meet SLSA build 3, and yeah, continue to follow updates. So that's the changes in SLSA 1.0, as well as what Adoptium is going to do next. So thanks.